Welcome to Ronald Reagan National Airport. We're here for a virtual tour of the Freedom Forum exhibit, First Amendment Freedoms, Women Win the Vote. I'm Patty Rule, the Vice President of Content Innovation at the Freedom Forum, and we figured since not many people are traveling these days that we'd take you here for a virtual tour of the exhibit. Now we start this exhibit with a quote from Abigail Adams. She is the wife of founding father John Adams. She told him, "Remember the ladies," as the founding fathers were writing the documents that would govern this new United States of America. And ladies, let's face it, they forgot. For most of America's history, women were second-class citizens, unable to vote, to own property, or even the clothing on their backs. Well, we explore this exhibit through the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of petition, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and there's even a religious element to this because much of the suffrage movement came out of the Quaker movement and their desire to abolish slavery. The mission of the Freedom Forum is to foster First Amendment freedoms for all. So let's start our tour with the freedom that Americans in our surveys say is their most cherished First Amendment freedoms: freedom of speech. Meet 2 pioneering suffragists, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Of course, women had been advocating for the right to vote for many years, but we start our story in 1848 with the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. More than 300 people, women and men, showed up, and the crowd was so overwhelming that the women bowed to the customs of the day and let Mott's husband preside over the events. 25 years after this convention took place, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a history of that moment, and it helped to reignite interest in the women's suffrage movement when it was flagging. Now let's meet Sojourner Truth. Women of color are often overlooked in the story of women's right to vote. Sojourner Truth was born into slavery. She stood 6 feet tall with muscled shoulders from working in the fields. She crisscrossed the country speaking of the twin ills of racism and sexism, and her speeches electrified the country. This image that you see of her is a composite image of her with Abraham Lincoln that the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, did to put her story on their cover. From freedom of speech, we move to freedom of the press, where we meet several revolutionary publishers who helped advocate for the cause of suffrage with their newspapers. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony created the Revolution newspaper to be the megaphone of the movement. And here is where less savory elements of the women's suffrage movement come into the fore. When Stanton and Anthony found out that the 15th Amendment would have given the right to vote to black men before women, they were furious, and they split off to form a more radical arm of the suffrage movement. Their new arm advocated for a women's right to divorce abusive husbands, for child care for working women, and for an amendment to the Constitution to promote women's suffrage. That amendment was first introduced in Congress in 1878. Now let's move to our third freedom, freedom of petition. We call this the Orphan Freedom because not many Americans know that freedom to petition the government for change is one of their First Amendment freedoms. Nonetheless, the suffragists made creative use of the freedom of petition to seek the right to vote for women. The women you see here in 1915 went on a suffrage road trip. They started in San Francisco and traveled more than 5,000 miles across the country, giving speeches and collecting signatures on a petition for the women's right to vote. Now remember, this is before the interstate highway system is in place, and the sight of women traveling alone is still quite unusual. Nonetheless, these women collected more than 500,000 signatures on their petition. Still, in this 72-year battle for a women's right to vote, we are 5 years away from women finally voting nationwide in their first presidential election. Now we come to our final freedom, freedom of assembly. There comes a time in any social justice movement when the practitioners of the cause need to take more radical tactics in order to gain the nation's attention. During World War I, many Americans, particularly men, felt the suffragists should put their demand for the vote on the back burner. But the suffragists weren't about to do that, and they organized parades and protests that really helped turn public sentiment toward the cause. Now we meet Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, 2 suffragists who organized the 1913 Women's March on Washington. They timed it to coincide with the crowds gathering for the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. Their gambit worked, but for disturbing reasons. As 8,000 women prepared to march down Pennsylvania Avenue, America's Main Street, a crowd of about 250,000 people gathered, and some of them shoved the women, the suffragists, into a very narrow space to march. The anti-suffragists cursed at the women, spat on them, poked them. The women fought back with hat pins and their banner poles. The police did very little to quell the violence, and the army was called in to regain peace. This infuriated people, and a congressional investigation was called. All of this further increasing support for a women's right to vote. 4 years later, in 1917, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized a protest that shocked the nation. A group of suffragists, dubbed the Silent Sentinels, marched in front of the White House. It's believed that this was the first White House protest. Woodrow Wilson was president at the time, and he was not particularly sympathetic to the cause of suffrage. Nonetheless, the Silent Sentinels marched in front of the White House 6 days a week for 2 years. Anti-suffragists harassed the women, tearing their banners and ripping the sashes from their bodies. The harassers were never arrested, but the Sentinels were arrested, some 200 of them, for obstructing justice. They were sent to a jail in Occoquan, Virginia, where they were beaten and force-fed. The Sentinels became a public relations nightmare for President Wilson, and in January 1918, he signaled his support for a women's suffrage amendment. Congress ratified the amendment in 1919. It took another year for the 36 states required to ratify the amendment to do so. It all came down to a state legislator in Tennessee whose mother told him, "Be a good boy and vote." Finally, on August 18, 1920, women nationwide won the right to vote. We've just ended a quick waltz through the 72-year movement ending with the passage of the most sweeping voting rights expansion in U.S. history. Let's end with a look at these reproductions of the banners that the suffragists actually used. They used the colors purple and white to symbolize loyalty and purity, and yellow was a nod to Kansas suffragists and their state flower, the sunflower. I hope you've enjoyed this virtual tour, and I hope you get a chance to see it in person. It'll be here at Reagan National Airport through December, and also at Dulles International Airport through December. Thanks so much for being with me, and enjoy your day.